Welcome to Reach Church. I'm Marshall Fant, the Director of Church Consulting and Strategic Planning for Gospel Fellowship Association Missions. My purpose is to encourage pastors and church leaders as you refocus, renew, and revitalize your churches. We've established this podcast to offer practical tips and suggestions as you equip disciples to make disciples. It's Marshall Fant. Welcome back to Reach Church, podcast by GFA Missions, focusing this series on preparing to preach, where I have the privilege of interviewing pastors about different books of the Bible they have labored through, and then with the same set of questions. So whether you are a pastor, a Bible study teacher, Sunday school teacher, and you're teaching through different books, we hope this will be a blessing to you. So I'm very thankful for GFA for sponsoring the podcast, and also for men who take their time to record. And again, Pastor Taigen Joos, welcome to our podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, just like the others, Taigen's a friend. He's a co-laborer. And so, Pastor Joos, tell everyone where you currently labor and about your wife and children.
I currently serve at Heritage Baptist Church in Dover, New Hampshire. Been here for just over 17 years. Been in New England for 24 years now, and we're thankful to be here. I have a wife and two children. My wife was a stay-at-home mom for many years, homeschooled our kids all through K through 12, and she was, I say a stay-at-home mom, she was a full-time worker.
Exactly.
At home.
I was waiting for that correction. Yeah.
Yes, sir. And after our kids graduated, she we agreed for her to get a job outside the home to help pay for kids' college. So she's doing that and doing wonderfully in her job. Our two kids are twins, boy and a girl, and they are entering their senior years of college right now, just started.
Yeah, and they're both aren't they musical, right? Tell me about that, just so people know.
Yeah, yes, sir. So they're both musical. We started them off in piano lessons early, and then they chose a second instrument later on. So currently, my son is a senior at Rice University's Shepherd School of Music in Houston, Texas, and he's an organ performance major, and my daughter is a harp performance major, senior year at New England Conservatory in Boston.
Wow! Why don't they pick easy instruments, right? I mean, really.
And lighter instruments.
I didn't think about that. All right. Well, thank you. And let me see, you pastored, I know you're from the West Coast. I see you're Seattle Mariners jersey, right? And so,
yes, sir. I was born and raised in Linwood, Washington.
There we go. All right. So, but you've been in New England. You served an associate pastor up in Maine, and now you're in New Hampshire. And also, for the sake of our listeners, Pastor Joos, you also sponsor or host a conference every October. Is that right? An annual Foundations Conference. Tell everybody about that in case they're in. I mean, that's perfect time of the year to come to New England, right? Is it? It's
beautiful time to come to New England.
Okay.
We've hosted this year. We're getting ready to host our 8th New England Foundations Conference. It's geared for any Christian in New England. Through the 6 New England states, and we're excited for this year. It's on October 19th, but it's every October, usually the week or two after Columbus Day weekend.
Okay.
And we're excited for this year's event.
Yeah, and we're recording this in September of 2024. So when he said that date in October, that will be 2024. So, but regardless, if you're going through New England in October, look up their church's website, and it would be you can receive a blessing and meet people in New England. Know how to pray for New England, because it had been a much overlooked area until several years ago, and several pastors have gone there. So, Pastor Joos, thank you for laboring in that particular corner of God's harvest field. So, thank you for that. All right.
You're very welcome. We started this as a means to try to encourage churches, Christians in New England. There's a lot of good churches, but a lot of them are just really small, and we just need encouragement to know that we're not serving alone.
Right.
And so that's one of the reasons why we started it.
And, when I've been in New England at conferences, I've heard comments, it's just good to hear others sing, right? Because the congregations are small. and you get together at a conference and they rejoice in the singing of and ministering to one another that way. So thanks for hosting that. Okay, so let's go to our topic, 1 Corinthians. I mean, what a great book to cover. All right, so Pastor Joos has agreed to deal with this book. And again, thanks for your labor of love and working through the book and preaching to your congregation. So tell us a little bit about it, number of messages, AM, PM, Wednesday night. How did you break it up? Just a little background, please, Taigen.
So I'm actually not finished preaching through the book yet. I am in the middle of chapter 15, currently, as of today's recording. But if I continue on the schedule that I've kind of mapped out, I should be able to finish that by Thanksgiving at the latest. Okay. So far, I've preached 56 messages through the book. I preached them in the morning worship service. I started the series actually in January of 2022, and I've taken a few breaks here and there through summer months or for the holidays, things of that nature.
Right.
So it's been almost 2 full years since I started it, but not continuously.
Sure.
Throughout each.
And you're doing that on Sunday mornings, you said, right?
Correct.
All right. So leading up to 1 Corinthians, before 1 Corinthians, what were you coming out of, or was there a particular event that led you to 1 Corinthians, or just your map for preaching, or give us a little background on that, please.
So 2021, I had preached and taught 2 series, or at least finishing 2 series on prophecy. So I had been preaching through the book of Daniel, for instance, in our morning worship service. And then 2021, I was finishing teaching through the book of Revelation in our adult Bible study class. So that was some pretty heavy messages and topics for teaching and discussions and that. And I thought, I want to do something very different, something New Testament, something that would probably hit a lot of different topics.
Sure.
And 1 Corinthians I was interested in. I've been reading it myself. And so I decided to do that book.
Yeah. All right. So coming into 1 Corinthians from Daniel, Revelation, how far in advance? So again, for our listeners' sake, our watchers' sake, when you prepare a series, whether 1 Corinthians or Genesis or whatever, how far in advance do you start, and what would be your process preparing yourself on a book like 1 Corinthians? Did you do anything unusual than your usual pattern, or did you stay with your usual pattern, or prepare the church in an unusual way or different way for you? Talk to us about that a little bit, please.
I didn't really do anything differently than what I normally do. I didn't really prep the congregation in any particular sense. I mean, I usually take a break from whatever series I'm in for at least the month of December. So I'd finished up Daniel, Revelation, I think it was probably mid-year or maybe in the fall of 2021. So I took a break from that. It was more topical. We were into the Thanksgiving, Christmas season. So I really developed that in December. And then ramping up then in January after the new year, I just started into the preaching of that book. As far as my own personal preparation, you read through it a few times. I ordered some commentaries. I went to the Detroit Baptist Theological Seminary website. They have a great list of recommended commentaries, things on each book. So I looked through that and ordered a couple from there that I didn't already have, along with some other commentaries that I did have already. And so I just jumped right into it, really.
All right. So, but your church is used to this, right? You're expositional, book by book, verse by verse, passage by passage. So this is the norm. This is your normal pattern. Would that be right? Would that be fair?
Yes, that's the majority of the type of sermons I do. Yes, sir.
Okay. So as you were going through that, the question I love to hear, my favorite question is this. All right. So as you're going through 1 Corinthians and as you are finishing it now, all right, Pastor Joos, what did you find is that key theological verse, or the verse the book kind of hinged on, is the way some people put it? In your view, as you labored through that, what was it for you? Which verse? Or verses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some books are very easy to find a purpose verse kind of thing. The Gospel of John is the easy one.
Yeah.
These things are written that you may know the Son of God, believe on him, and so forth at the end of the book. There's nothing really like that overtly in the book of 1 Corinthians. The book is so full of different topics, different subject matters that the church was dealing with, problems, things that Paul was hearing, both from people as well as the letters that they were writing him. But if I were to give an answer to that, I'd probably say a couple different passages really kind of linked together. I think the very beginning of the book, Paul calls them saints, called to be saints. He calls them in chapter 6, verses 9 through 11. He goes to that list. You're this, but such were some of you, and now you're washed and justified and sanctified and so forth. Really, I think that's a good theme for the whole book. Paul is trying to correct what they were and how they're still practicing some of those things like what they were, and encouraging them to be more of how God created them new in Christ. So that shift of thought pattern, the shift of behavior pattern that follows that, their theology, of course, is foundational to that. So that's not really a great answer, I know, but I think it's interesting to me how this young church, Paul called saints, Christ called saints, of course, they're full of problems. Yeah. And Paul is saying, all right, now live like how you've been called.
Amen.
You're called a saint. Now let me help you learn how to live more like a saint.
Now, as you did your prep work, did you find, as you're working through the book, did you know this is where you're going to land on this ahead of time, or no, as you work through it?
Yes, it's really come to light through the book. As I said, sometimes I remember former pastor used to say you can usually find the key to the book either at the front door, at the back door, kind of the front or the end of the book. Yeah. And it's just me personally. Others could probably find a lot more easily, but I had a hard time finding it in either one of those places. So it's just kind of as I've taught through it and preached through it, that has just kind of developed in my mind, at least, as a key idea.
I'm sure that will help our listeners as they start at least, okay, how do I figure this out? So that's great insight. So, and I think so many times as we work through books, this is what happens. Even if somebody else had named the key verse separately, as you work through it with your congregation at that season of ministry, that could be different for each group. So thanks for sharing that. All right, so let me ask you this. So as you work through 1 Corinthians, what was the greatest theological challenge? What passage or what words or what verses presented to you that kept you up at night, early in the mornings, working through it?
Well, for anybody who has thought about preaching through 1 Corinthians, and if you know anything about the book, there's a lot of different topics in that book. Yes. And some of them can be pretty sticky wickets to work through. I think for me personally, some of the bigger ones were 1 Corinthians chapters 8 through 10.
All right.
About the meat offered to idols section and how Paul addressed that and gave answers to that. But I think the theological challenge to that was finding the theological nugget, the principle that underlies Paul's arguments there, and making that something that is relevant to our people today. Wow. I mean, no one in our churches is taking a piece of chicken and going home and presenting it on their hearth to some kind of idol.
Right.
We're not doing that. But what was Paul really getting at? What is the underlying theological principle? So that passage really, I had to think a lot about that and try to really make that practical, at least in some sense. And it was hard. And even reading the commentaries, trying to figure out, and this is more applicational maybe than theological, but they're linked, is
sure.
What are some modern similar circumstances to which chapters 8 through 10 would somewhat parallel? And the commentators couldn't really think of much of any that were really parallel in some sense, which of course made it a little bit more difficult and how to present that then to the church. But I sought to at least give some general principles of life and how to deal with conscience issues or dealing with people who are different, that kind of thing.
So did you find any other resources that helped you work through that? Or is this just where meditation on the word and prayer and Lord, I need your help in helping people put this into practice? What did you do there?
Yeah, it was me begging for God's mercy in this. And I tried to think through what is the principle here. And a big principle that I ended up bringing out, particularly in those 3 chapters, was others before self. Paul hits on that kind of theme many times throughout those passages where, hey, it's lawful for me, so why can't I do it? Well, let's think of other things or other people other than just me.
Right.
It's the glory. We do all things for the glory of God, the end of chapter 10. And we all know the verse. Many people have memorized that verse, but that's in the context here of meat offered to idols. And everything that we do, we don't do for our own sake, our own glory. We're doing it for the glory of God. So that principle is others before self. I really hammered many times throughout that session as Paul deals with that idea.
Yeah, that's great, because again, at the end of chapter 10, we all know these verses, but we don't always put them in the context like you just said. So I think that is very helpful. And again, this is, Taigen, the reason I like to interview pastors on this topic is you have labored there. You have worked the fields. You have gotten the stumps out. Okay, Lord, what does this mean? I've got to make this where our people can understand it and apply it. So, isn't it fair to say, Taigen, that if we're honest, this is the work of the ministry. This is part of laboring in the Word, is wrestling with these passages to come away with what your church needs. You want to comment on anything that pastors?
Very much so, and each church is going to be different. Their needs are going to be different, where the people are, what they're doing, and so forth. And each pastor is going to be different. I'm not the sharpest pencil in the box with everything, so I'm just trying to figure out what's going to be helpful for me. What am I gleaning from this in my personal life as I'm studying this, and how can I make this relevant? I mean, we're 2,000 years apart from Paul's writing this book, and he's talking about situations and circumstances that we don't even know how to think about. Those meat offered to idols and going to the temple markets and figuring out what is and what isn't this. That's just a hard thing for people to grasp today.
Yeah.
And so we have to really, there's the historical context, the cultural context, and all those kind of things, let alone the wording and the grammar and everything like that. There's a lot to sift through, and none of us are going to get it perfectly. We're trying to do our best. I'm just trying to do my best to present to our people how I've been led to understand the text, and hopefully it'll be helpful for everyone in your church.
Now, let me ask you another question. This is totally a side note here. Had your church ever covered, while you were there, 1 Corinthians, either in Sunday school, or do you know if it's been covered in another format? Or I was just curious here.
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, all right. Because there is so much in the context of this. Okay, so let me ask you this. You've already mentioned the application. So, and again, I appreciate the way you brought in theology with application, because correct interpretation of theology will then lead you to proper application of our life. So let me just ask you this. Was there in any other challenges? You mentioned 8 through 10. Any other challenges that immediately come to mind on the application side? where you would say, wow, okay, what hair I had left, I just lost. Okay. I mean, were there anything else you want to talk to the men about, or ladies?
Yes, you mentioned the topic actually, and the issue.
I didn't think about it. That was not a prompt. Okay.
Yes, very, very well done. Chapter 11, the beginning part of chapter 11, that is a tricky passage.
Yeah.
And there's various interpretations of what the head covering is, whether the head covering is applicable today, and if so, how and when, and all these things. And that was one text I knew was coming.
Right.
And I thought, I really need to pray about this even before I get to the chapter. And, you know, I'm in chapters 7, 8, and 9. I'm thinking chapter 11's coming.
Yes.
And I've got to really think and pray through this. And I finally got to that. That was earlier this year, the beginning of this year, I believe. And I just told the people, I said, this is one of the most difficult passages of the book to really sift through and come to solid conclusions about, and even applications for today. And I gave it my best shot. I gave what different perspectives were on the passage. I communicated where I land in my own interpretation and application of the text, but that was a tough one. And, you know, we're so thankful for our wives.
Amen.
After the sermon, after the services were done, we were going home, and, you know, sometimes I just try to ask my wife, did that make sense? Anything that I said makes sense. And thankfully she was very encouraging and said, I think you handled that very well.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there may be people in the church that are going to disagree with you no matter what position you take on that passage, but I just try to give my best shot. That was a big one that I knew was coming, and I thought and prayed a lot about that one.
Yeah, and I think another great way to look at it and is about head coverings. You know, when my wife and I travel overseas to either minister to missionaries or teach or whatever, there are several countries that the women are expected. I'm thinking of the Ukraine. I'm thinking of Cameroon. I'm pretty sure Cameroon was that way. That when you're in the Lord's house, the women's heads will be covered. So the culture, and what's expected in that culture has a huge context of what we should do when we go to other places to worship. So, yeah,
which really goes back then to the chapter 8 through 10 idea too.
Right.
That we're putting others before self in this.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. Okay. All right. So here we go. Any other challenges there on application you want to bring up? Because I think I may have cut you off.
I'll just mention one more.
Sure.
Chapters 12 through 14, of course, deal with spiritual gifts and issues within the church and worship and so forth. Chapter 14 particularly has a few verses there toward the end that deal with women's role in the church.
Right.
And of course, that's such a hot topic today in denominations all over the country, and dealing with this egalitarianism, so forth. So I needed to be careful in how I dealt with that, but biblical in how I dealt with that. But that was a bit of a challenge too.
Wow. All right. Again, thanks for your input on this. I'm sure it will be very helpful. All right, so let's talk about the gospel. Again, you mentioned 1 Corinthians 6, such were some of you, one of the greatest passages of hope and what Christ does for our life. Any other, I mean, did you find it? I mean, I don't know how you cannot, but the gospel throughout Corinthians, you found it easy to preach that?
Yeah, it's all through the book.
Yeah.
Chapter 1 starts with it, the ministry that Paul had, preaching the gospel, the ministry of the word. And it starts there. I'm in chapter 15 now, of course, the beginning of that chapter, the resurrection, the gospel there.
Yeah.
And really all throughout the book, it's very easy to take whatever topic Paul is dealing with, and it either overtly communicates the gospel or it very easily leads to the gospel. It's not hard at all.
Wow. All right. Thank you. That's very, very well said. Now, if you could, all right, now this may be, I mean, I'm looking at your backdrop, okay, with your books. If you could limit to just one commentary on 1 Corinthians, okay, and then we can talk about others. But again, Bible study leader, Sunday school teacher, they got the budget for one commentary. Layman's terms, something they could easily understand. You have a recommendation for us?
Sure. So one of the commentaries that I ended up purchasing was one by, last name is Thistleton. I can't remember his first name, actually.
Is it Thistle? Is it TH or F or PH?
TH.
TH, okay. All right.
And he's actually done two. One is a lengthy one, more in depth, and there's also a short one. I have the short one.
Okay.
So it's a little bit simplified, shorter in length, but that one is very accessible, very readable. And at the end of each passage that he deals with, he has several kind of helpful tips in teaching or preaching.
Yeah.
Things that you could pull out of that particular passage. So for a layman, Sunday school teacher, whatever, who just wants to study the book, that would be a tremendous book to get, the shorter one especially.
All right. On the pastor level, I didn't ask you to prepare for this, but what were some of your favorites that dealt with, some of the theological or word problems or text problems or whatever could come up? Did you have a favorite on that one, or one or two?
Probably Gordon Fee is probably a common one, and that is very more in depth with language and all that kind of thing. That's a good one. I think F.F. Bruce.
Yep.
Had a really good one.
Yeah.
I've enjoyed anything I've read from him.
Yeah.
So probably one of those two would be good.
Good. Yeah, those are two classics on that, and again, highly recommended. All right. So was there any commentator or commentary that gave you a unique view of history or culture or context? And this is kind of a question I really didn't tell you to be ready for, but was there something that really just helped put a verse? Oh, I got that now. Can you think of anything like that along the way, or just the whole set of comment, in meditation and prayer?
Yeah. So especially those difficult passages, the really tricky ones, I'm reading probably 7 or 8 different commentaries just to try to gain something that's going to be particularly helpful.
Sure.
I wouldn't say there's one that necessarily stood out, but
okay.
That's part of the beauty of reading widely in a bunch of different commentaries. You get different perspectives, and when you put them all together, especially if a lot of them tend to agree with one another.
Right.
That's usually a pretty good sign too.
You're pretty safe.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't say there's one that particularly does something differently or better in that sense than another. But that's just me. I don't know the right one.
That's good. No, and that was kind of an extra question there. So, all right. So right now you're almost finished. You hope to finish by Thanksgiving or somewhere right in there. All right. So you're on you're on the home stretch. So already looking back, what would you do differently, if anything? Would you made it the series, not as many passages, or say, no, you need this many passages, or this many messages, not passages, you need this many messages, because you are working through a lot of sticky wickets. Okay. So what would you recommend there? If you had to do over again, what would you do differently?
I don't mind the number of sermons that I've done for the book, especially since I've taken a few lengthier breaks between different sections. And when I ended a particular length of time in preaching, I try to end it at the end of one of the main sections of the book.
Yeah.
So I didn't leave anybody hanging. So I don't mind that it's taken 2 years. I don't mind that it'll be about 65 or 66, something like that, messages through the book. But if I would do something differently, I would take a little bit more time, maybe do a few side mini-series on some of these particular subjects. For instance, when you get to chapter 7 and you're dealing with marriage and singleness and all those kind of things, I preach through the section as it's laid out, but that chapter would easily lend itself to a little side mini series on marriage and divorce and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. Or when you get to chapter 12 through 14, this is just me. I've just preached through the chapters as they are. But again, that would lend itself very easily to a little side mini series on the spiritual gifts specifically. Sure. To deal with those in a lot more detail than I have. So stuff like that. Right. There's a lot of topics in the book. You can do church discipline from chapter 5 and do a whole little mini series on that subject and so forth. I haven't done that. And that would be, that would be a different way to do it. It would take a lot longer than to get through the book, but it would be a different way to approach that.
Or you could come back and do a Sunday night mini series on each of those, right?
You could, or a Sunday school class or something like that.
Yeah, it's well said. Because really, you have, as a pastor, you've got so much of the exegetical work already done, and on a Sunday morning you can't cover it all. So that is a tremendous thought. Thanks for that. That's a good idea. Thanks for sharing that. I think that could be very well applied either in Sunday school or Sunday night. Now, would you? All right. So let's just say I said, Taigen, I want to do that on Sunday night. Do you think I should do it at a separate time or just following that Sunday morning series? Or is that, you may not know yet because you're not finished, but just off the top, would you say, no, I would park it for now and come back later and do a mini series? That's my gut feel, but what would you think?
Yeah, I would agree with that. You just have to figure out your own congregation and schedule and how inquisitive your congregation might be about a particular subject.
Yeah, and especially marriage. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
If it were me, I'd probably do it in a like a Sunday school class type of format. We call them discipleship classes. Yep. But I just like that because of the interactiveness that I create in those classes, which when you get to a particular subject matter that is a little bit more tricky, then you have a chance to interact, ask questions, answer questions, and deal with all these things that people are hearing in our culture. I enjoy doing that, and I think a class like that would really lend itself to some of those more particular subjects.
Yeah, and I think, and again, as a pastor, my opinion is when you do that, you're building your people's confidence in the Word, when they can sit down and see how all this fits together. Right. So that's a great idea. Okay, great. Thank you for that. All right, so last question. How did this series impact you spiritually? As a believer, a father, pastor in New England, where churches are smaller and you're more isolated, maybe than where I am in the South. So how did this series impact you as a believer?
Me as a preacher, it's been a great study for me personally. I've enjoyed doing it. I tell people sometimes, I get the benefit of studying the text all week, and I'm just trying to share with you and preach to you. I'm preaching to myself, but you get to hear it, that kind of thing. Yeah. So I've enjoyed it personally. One of the things that's really struck me, I think, just in general, a very general thought, this church at Corinth was not a mature church. It had not been around for decades. It was not a church full of people who had a lot of years of theological maturity under the belts. Right. But you think about how much ink Paul spilled on them. We have two of the letters in our Bible. There's at least two others that we don't. Right. And the fact that Paul could call this church, you are called to be saints. That's a tremendous truth, that this young, immature, full of problems church, they're still God's saints. Amen. And Paul loved on them. He taught them. He was patient with them, dealt with a lot of situations, trying to help them learn and grow and change. And boy, for any pastor, including this one, that is such a helpful thing to remember, that, many of us pastors, we've been to seminary and, we've been saved many years and we know the lingo and we know a lot of stuff, but many people in our church don't. And we just need to love them and patiently teach them, answer their questions, be patient with them some more, and help them try to learn and grow through problems, just like we've had to learn and grow through problems.
Right.
So I think in my mind, that's a big lesson for anybody to learn.
Wow. Well said. Well said. For the sake of our listeners, let me ask you this. Are your sermons posted online?
Yes, sir. They're on sermon audio.
Okay. So your church website is, what's the church website?
hbcdover.com.
Heritage Baptist Church, Dover, Ohio. Dover, Ohio. Excuse me. Dover, New Hampshire. New Hampshire. Okay, yeah. I do know where you are. All right.
Yeah.
And then, so if you want to go and listen to how Taigen handles some of these passages, that'd be a great encouragement to you. And again, I want to thank Pastor Joos for taking his time to invest in others. Okay, any closing comments? Taigen Joos.
I wanted to share one thing that I've done probably a little differently than a normal expositional series. So for our church, we celebrate the Lord's Supper every other month, which is six Sundays a year. And what I try to do for each of those every year is pick a theme for those services, particularly to preach through. And this year, what I chose to do is take the 1 Corinthians 11 text that deals with the Lord's Supper, really the only New Testament epistle that gives a lengthy discussion about that. And I've taken just that passage and divided it up into 6 sermons, and I'm preaching those throughout the year. So my actual last sermon through 1 Corinthians will be the last few verses of chapter 11, early in November. So that's just how we've done it, but I like the thematic approach to our Lord's Supper, and that's just how we do it here.
Yeah.
I told our people when we finished the first half of chapter 11, I said, now I'm going to get to these verses, but we're going to cover them throughout the year. And we just jumped right then to chapter 12.
Oh, that's good. That's a great way to do it. So just side note, you do the Lord's Supper in the morning or the evening?
Morning.
Morning. Good. All right. Okay. Any other comments? That was a great add-on. Anything else there?
No, I can't think of anything. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
No, we greatly appreciate you taking the time. And again, go to Pastor Joos's church's webpage. You can find more information. Again, if you're in New England in October, look at his church's website. Maybe you can catch a conference and encourage the people there in New England. So, Pastor Joos, thank you. And again, want to thank all the great folks here at GFA that make this possible, both recording, editing, putting up, all that I have no idea how to do. So I want to appreciate the great staff here. And if you got any questions for me, you can email me at mfant@gfamissions.org. And it's been a great blessing to have Pastor Taigen Joos with us today. Again, brother, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.
You're listening to ReChurch, a podcast of Gospel Fellowship Association Missions. If you would like more information about our ministry or how we may assist you and your church, visit us at gfamissions.org/consulting.